Hi, I'm Adrienne Klasa, editor of This is Africa at the Financial Times. I'm here at the World Bank annual meetings here in Washington, D.C., and I'm here with Helen Hai. Helen, thank you so much for being here with me. And you are the CEO of the Made in Africa initiative, as well as the UNIDO Goodwill Ambassador. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
It's my pleasure.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is you do a lot of consulting work, both with Chinese companies and also with the government there in terms of their investment strategy going into the region. Now in 2015, the Chinese government announced that there was a $60 billion pot of development-focused investment money that was going to flow into the continent. What are the priorities for the government and also for the investors that they're leading for this funding?
First of all, I think talking about China's strategy to Africa, is there like a big grand strategy? In my opinion, the answer is no. The strategy actually, Chinese foreign policy, particular to Africa, in my opinion, is very much cross the river by touching the stones, understanding what actually needed by the African government, and then providing that kind of support. And then let's look at this 60 billion. I think this is in line with the new SDG, which is talking about the shared prosperity. And this time, under the 60 billion, there's 10 projects. The top 4, in my opinion, are the most important one, and are in the following order. Number 1, industrialization for Africa. Number 2 is modern agriculture development for Africa. Number 3, financing. Number 4, infrastructure. So as you can see from the order, financing and infrastructure becoming the enablers of the first 2, and the first 2 is very much focusing on the economic transformation. So the new strategy, I would say, actually is what Africa needed at this moment, also in line with the SDG, how to support underdeveloping countries for their economic transformation. And then the industrialization and modern agriculture development is on top of the agenda.
And in terms of deployment, I mean, how much of the capital has actually been deployed at this point?
Because we're only in year 1, and I think at this stage, I don't have a detailed figure yet, but still a lot of still in big planning stage.
Now, you mentioned the industrialization focus of that sort of policy drive, but also, I mean, industrialization is obviously something that China did incredibly well in its development trajectory. And now there's a lot of conversation about the fact that as labor costs rise in Asia, there are going to be manufacturers that want to jump over to Africa. Is this just an economic theory, or is this actually happening in practice en masse as it is envisioned, as opposed to just sort of a few companies here and there?
Okay, talking about economic transformation, I want to first talk about some figures. Since Second World War, in the world, there's about 200 developing economies. There's only 2 economies actually moved from lower income to higher income. That is Taiwan and Korea. And then there's only 13 economies moved from middle income to higher income. That is the Asia 4 tigers, and then the other 8 of them are actually in Europe. The original GDP gap are very small. So actually Asia made a significance in terms of economic transformation, but rest of the other continent, like particularly in Africa, most of the countries are still trapped in poverty. Clearly there's some secret should be learned by the Asia success. And one of the 2 things I would say about Asia's success, number 1, what is the key for poverty reduction? I would say job creation. Secondly, the fundamental secret for economic transformation in China and the Asia 4 tigers in the 60s and 80s is because they all captured the window of opportunity during industrialization relocation, which created millions of jobs. That is the jump start in their economic transformation. Like what you just said, after 30 years, golden manufacturing, China is moving up the ladders. So China is about to relocate 85 million jobs. So there is definitely a golden opportunity for those underdeveloping countries. If they're able to capture, a significant proportion of the 85 million jobs, they have the same opportunity to enjoy the economic growth like what China and Asia 4 Tiger did. And now reality, I would really like to share with you, from 2011, nobody believed Africa would become a manufacturing floor. Until today, some countries has been making significance. For example, Ethiopia. I came to Ethiopia to set up a shoe factory back in 2011. What happened to today? The newly built industrial zone Avasa will be fully occupied. The estimated export in that one zone will be $1 billion US. In that one zone, the estimated job creation for local will be 50,000 jobs. That is just one zone. So Ethiopia really has already, I would say, started this industrialization journey, and they are on the right track for sure. And in Rwanda, part also the Joint Africa Made in Africa initiative, we helped Rwanda to build the first garment factory last year and creating 1,000 jobs with less than a year. We are taking cottons from Burundi, textile from Uganda, making garments to export to the US market. So through industrialization, a small landlocked country like Rwanda can be transformed to a land-connected country. And then in the past 2 years, there's also 7 Africa head of states joining the initiative. There is Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Djibouti, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. So I would really share with you is there is an industrialization movement has already started in the Africa continent.
Now, you mentioned that you first came to Ethiopia in 2011, and obviously Ethiopia has been watched very closely as an example for industrialization drives across the region. The government is obviously very development-minded and had a very specific strategy in place. Now we're seeing some unrest happening in Ethiopia. There have been several protests, there have been issues with police firing on protesters, and also foreign investment facilities have been targeted. How does that affect your outlook for your companies and also the companies that you're advising coming into Ethiopia, looking at it as a hub for industrialization?
I think if we're talking about industrialization, even in China, it's not a one-year process, it's a journey. China went through that journey for the past 20 years. And then during that time, there has been a lot of negative press in the West talking about this journey is not going to be successful. But look at the result today. So I think Ethiopia is also in this journey. There will be negative press report, but is it really going to affect the result? I don't think so. But another thing I want to talk about Ethiopia is in the 1960s, at that time, in the World Bank report even, they are talking about Asia is a hopeless continent. But then at that time, Japan being the first country actually taking the economic transformation, which is setting a great successful example for the other countries follow. And then the Asia for Tiger followed. And then China really followed in the past 30 years, making the economic transformation, really leading a great example for the rest of the world. I think how we can help Africa, I think what Africa needs is also successful examples and also most importantly successful countries to start this kind of journey. And I think Ethiopia definitely has been in that position, creating a successful country, successful example and leading other countries to follow.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were 85 million jobs from China and from Asia that might jump over potentially to Africa, but also elsewhere. We're also at a point where people are talking a lot about the fourth industrial revolution. So a lot of mechanization, roboticization of jobs that used to be available for sort of, entry level and sort of perhaps not incredibly well educated workers. Does that pose a challenge to the kind of industrial transformation that you're talking about?
That's a very good question, because actually when I first heard of fourth industrial revolution, I had the same concern. So what I did in the past 1 year, I've been also working together with World Economic Forum, understanding what actually is the fourth industrial revolution, what's the impact. What I've learned about this fourth industrial revolution, currently a lot of technology developed in US and in Europe actually is not to replace the most intensive manual labor works, because it might seem very easy for human, but that's actually very difficult for machine to do it. Current technology developed is very much in the service industry. That's why we're seeing like in this part of the world, robot can place pharmacists, accountant, lawyers. So the technology is to serving the service industry. So what that actually mean to Africa? I would say, I mentioned earlier, the GDP per capita in China back in 1978 is $154 US, which is less than 1/3 of sub-Saharan African countries. But at that time, the GDP per capita in US and Europe are much higher. But then after the past 35 years, China moved up. Africa has been trapped into the bottom. What this actually fourth industrial revolution is going to do, because they're all developed in the service industry, is going to help countries, like China. For example, Alibaba, China has already been in the global value chain to do more leapfrogging. For example, Alibaba help a lot of small traders are not able to get into the global value chain. They can get it because China has already become in the manufacturing floor for the world. So that means through this fourth industrial revolution, China and also other countries who are already in the global value chain, they can do more leapfrogging. But then that's left the countries trapped still at the bottom who has never been into the value chain. But let's thinking about what's the impact of that in the next 15 years if we are talking about SDG, shared prosperity. The problem is actually the economic gap will be much bigger. But it is an issue we cannot ignore for the rest of us. Why? Let's look at the demographic issue of Africa. Currently, it's a continent of 1.2 billion population. Most of them are young people. We've already seen the issues. Without decent job creation, there will be a war, there will be refugees going to Europe and illegal immigrants. So if we cannot help Africa to create decent jobs in the next 10 years, I think it's not just Africa's problem, it's the world's problem, because the scale of the demographic numbers in the continent.
Helen, thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.